November 15, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through Massachusetts countryside, carrying 43 German women toward an uncertain fate. Inside the canvas-covered vehicle, Liesl Hartmann pressed her thin frame against the cold metal bench, her stomach hollow from months of diminishing rations. She had learned to ignore hunger, to push past the constant gnawing that had become as familiar as breathing. Around her, the other women sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms hanging loose on bodies that had forgotten what fullness felt like. The truck lurched to a stop outside a compound surrounded by wire fencing. Guard towers stood at each corner, their silhouettes sharp against the late autumn sky. As the women filed out, Liesl caught sight of American soldiers watching them with expressions she couldn't quite read. Not hatred exactly, but not kindness either. Just observation, careful and measured. Captain Elizabeth Warren stood near the camp entrance, clipboard in hand, her uniform crisp despite the cold wind. She called out names in carefully pronounced German, assigning barrack numbers with military efficiency. Liesl noticed how the captain's eyes lingered on each woman's face, as if searching for something beyond the enemy uniform they wore. Margarete Fischer, whom everyone called Greta, moved to stand beside Liesl. At 26, Greta was one of the older prisoners, a baker's daughter from Munich who had served as a supply coordinator. Her hands, once strong from kneading dough, now trembled slightly in the cold. She leaned close and whispered in German, "Do you think they'll feed us today, or make us wait as punishment?" Liesl had no answer. In Germany, food had become a weapon, a tool of control and degradation. Rations had shrunk month by month until meals consisted of watery soup and bread that tasted more of sawdust than wheat. She had seen what hunger did to people, how it reduced them to shadows of themselves, stripped away dignity until only desperation remained. Young Clara Schneider, barely 19, stood behind them with eyes too wide, too frightened. She had been captured only weeks earlier and still carried the shock of it in her posture. "My mother used to make potato soup," she murmured to no one in particular. "Real potatoes, not just the peels. I wonder if I'll ever taste that again." The women were marched toward their assigned barracks, passing by a building from which unexpected smells drifted on the wind. Liesl's nose caught something she hadn't experienced in so long she almost didn't recognize it. The rich, savory aroma of cooking meat. Real meat, not the occasional scrap of gristle they'd been given in recent months. Her stomach clenched involuntarily, a physical response to the possibility of food that seemed too impossible to believe. Greta noticed it too. "Propaganda," she said firmly, though her voice carried doubt. "They're cooking for themselves, not for us. We're prisoners, enemies. Why would they waste food on enemies?" But even as she spoke, Sergeant Thomas Blake approached their group, his weathered farmer's face neutral but not unkind. "Dinner's at 1800 hours, he said in slow, clear English. "Mess hall is that building there." The mess hall doors opened at exactly 1800 hours, revealing long tables with benches on either side. Liesl entered with the other women, their footsteps hesitant on the wooden floor. The room smelled impossibly rich, filled with aromas that seemed more like memory than reality. Steam rose from large metal serving trays at the front of the hall, tended by American soldiers wearing kitchen aprons over their uniforms. Captain Warren gestured for the women to form a line. They obeyed mechanically, years of military discipline overriding their confusion. Liesl found herself moving forward, metal tray in hand, expecting the familiar disappointment of thin gruel or stale bread. Instead, Sergeant Blake stood behind the serving counter with a large ladle, scooping generous portions onto each plate. "Ham and beans," he announced simply, placing a thick slice of pink meat beside a mound of beans swimming in rich brown sauce. Then he added a piece of cornbread, golden and steaming, with a pat of real butter melting on top. Liesl stared at her tray. The portion was larger than anything she had seen in 2 years. The ham was actual meat, marbled with fat, not the gray scraps they had called protein in Germany. The beans glistened with molasses and what looked like chunks of bacon. Her hands began to shake. Behind her, Greta received her portion and immediately whispered in German, This cannot be real. This is too much. They're trying to trick us somehow. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her plate. Is this what they eat? Every day? The women sat together at one end of a long table, their trays before them, like offerings they were afraid to accept. Across the hall, American soldiers ate their own meals, talking and laughing as if this abundance was ordinary, unremarkable. Private Daniel Costa glanced over at the silent German women and nudged Sergeant Blake. They're not eating. Blake walked over slowly, his boots loud in the suddenly quiet space. He stopped near Liesel's table and spoke in simple English. Food's hot now. Gets cold if you wait. He made an eating motion with his hand, encouraging. Liesel looked at Greta, then at the other women. Someone had to be first. Someone had to break the spell of disbelief. She picked up her fork, cut a small piece of ham, and brought it to her mouth. The taste exploded across her tongue, salty, sweet, rich with flavor she had forgotten existed. The meat was tender, not tough, real. Actual food meant for human consumption, not animal feed disguised as rations. A sob caught in her throat. She chewed slowly, swallowed, then took another bite. Around her the other women began to eat. Some cried quietly as they chewed. Others ate in stunned silence, their faces registering shock with each mouthful. This was enemy generosity they had no framework to understand. This was kindness that contradicted everything they had been taught about American cruelty. The following morning brought oatmeal with brown sugar, fresh milk, and sliced apples. Liesel watched Clara pour milk into her bowl with trembling hands, the white liquid splashing over the edges. Real milk, not the powdered substitute or watered-down mixture they had grown accustomed to in Germany. The girl brought the spoon to her lips and closed her eyes, a single tear sliding down her cheek. At the serving line, Sergeant Blake noticed their continued amazement. He was a man of few words, his weathered face suggesting years spent working soil rather than fighting wars. His family ran a dairy farm in Vermont, and he understood food not as luxury but as sustenance, as care. He watched the German women eat with the same careful attention he might give to cattle recovering from illness. "You like the oatmeal?" he asked Greta, who had returned for a second helping, something she had done with visible embarrassment, as if expecting refusal. Greta's English was limited, but she nodded vigorously. "Ja. Yes. Is good. Very good." She gestured to her bowl. "My father, he make bread. Before war, good bread, like this food." Blake's expression softened. "Your father's a baker?" "Was baker," Greta corrected, her voice dropping. "Bakery is gone now. Bombs." Something shifted in Blake's face. He disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later with a small notebook and pencil. He drew a simple picture of bread, then looked at Greta expectantly. She understood immediately, taking the pencil and sketching the twisted shape of a pretzel, then a braided loaf. Blake nodded with recognition. Private Costa joined them, carrying a crate of potatoes that needed peeling. He was third-generation Italian-American, raised in a Boston neighborhood where food meant family, where feeding someone was the most basic act of love. He set the crate down and made a peeling motion, offering the task to any women who wanted to help. Liesel stood first. Work, she understood. Work was familiar ground in this strange landscape of unexpected kindness. She took a knife and potato, her nurse's hands steady and efficient. Greta joined her, then Clara, then 6 more women. They worked in silence at first, but the familiar rhythm of kitchen labor created its own comfort. Corporal Ruth Williams, the camp nurse, brought them coffee midway through the morning. Real coffee, strong and hot, sweetened with sugar that was not rationed or replaced with substitutes. She smiled as she poured, her round face genuine in its warmth. "You're doing good work," she said, knowing they understood tone if not all the words. By noon, the walls between captors and captives had not fallen, but they had developed small cracks. The language of food required no translation. The act of preparing meals together created a bridge that words alone could not build. Liesel peeled potatoes beside women who were supposed to be her enemies and felt, for the first time since capture, almost human again. 3 weeks passed, and the autumn cold deepened into early winter. The German women had stopped flinching when food appeared. They no longer examined their plates for signs of contamination or trickery, but they had not stopped marveling. Each meal brought new discoveries that challenged everything they thought they knew about wartime deprivation. Liesel found herself assigned to kitchen duty on a rotation basis, working alongside Helen Baxter, the camp's head cook. Helen was a stout woman in her 50s, with flour permanently dusted into the creases of her apron and a no-nonsense approach to feeding people. She had raised 6 children on a working-class budget and believed that good food fixed most problems, or at least made them easier to bear. On a gray December morning, Helen pulled out ingredients for apple pie. Real apples, not preserved or canned, but fresh fruit that still held the scent of orchards. She set them before Liesel with a peeling knife and demonstrated the motion, her thick hands surprisingly graceful. Liesel had peeled potatoes and turnips 1,000 times, but apples for dessert felt like an impossible luxury. "We eat this? Sweet?" Liesel asked in halting English, gesturing to the sugar Helen was measuring out in cups, not teaspoons. "Every Sunday," Helen confirmed. "Sometimes Wednesday too, if I'm feeling generous." She rolled out pie dough with practiced efficiency, the butter in the crust leaving golden streaks across the floured surface. Greta appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the smell of cinnamon. Her eyes widened at the sight of the apples, the sugar, the butter used without restraint. "In Munich," she said quietly, "we saved butter for 1 month to make 1 cake for Christmas. 1 small cake, for whole family." Helen paused in her rolling, really looking at Greta for the first time. "You saved for a month?" "Sometimes 2 months," Greta replied. "And then only if we were lucky. Most times, no butter at all." The revelation settled over the kitchen like snow. Helen had complained about wartime rationing in America, about the restrictions on sugar and meat, about doing without certain luxuries. But she had never gone hungry. Her children had never skipped meals or eaten bread made from sawdust. She returned to her pie making with new quiet, her movements thoughtful. That evening, when the pies emerged golden and steaming from the oven, Helen cut generous slices for the German women first. She watched as Liesel took her first bite, saw the girl's face transform with something beyond pleasure, something closer to grief for all the years of deprivation that made this simple dessert feel like a miracle. Private Costa, eating his own slice nearby, noticed Clara crying silently over her plate. "Is it bad?" he asked with concern. "No," Clara whispered, wiping her eyes. "Is too good. I forget food can be this good." She took another bite, savoring it like a memory she was trying to preserve. "I forget people can be this good too." November 23, 1944. The mess hall had been transformed overnight with paper decorations and hand-drawn autumn leaves taped to the walls. The German women entered for breakfast and stopped short, confused by the unusual preparations. Captain Warren stood at the front of the hall with an announcement that Sergeant Blake translated slowly into simple English they could understand. "Today is Thanksgiving," she explained. "An American holiday. A day we give thanks and share a meal together." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "We would like you to join us for dinner tonight. Not as prisoners, but as guests." The women exchanged uncertain glances. Liesel felt Greta's hand grip her arm tightly. This felt like dangerous territory, like kindness that might carry hidden costs. In their experience, special treatment always came with expectations, with prices that would be extracted later. But Captain Warren's face showed no deception, only a tentative hopefulness that made her seem less like a military commander and more like a woman trying to do something right in a world gone terribly wrong. That afternoon, the kitchen became a theater of impossible abundance. Helen and her staff prepared a feast that seemed pulled from a dream. 3 turkeys roasted in the ovens, their skin crisping to deep golden brown, fat dripping and sizzling on the pans below. Potatoes were mashed with real butter and cream until they were clouds of white richness. Stuffing baked in deep pans, fragrant with sage and onions. Cranberry sauce gleamed like jewels in serving bowls. Liesel and Greta were invited to help with preparations, and they moved through the kitchen in stunned silence. The amount of food being prepared for a single meal exceeded what their families might have seen in 6 months. Greta kept touching things to verify their reality: the butter in its pound blocks, the cream in glass bottles, the bread made from pure white flour with no fillers or substitutes. "This is for prisoners?" she asked Helen, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. "All this food, for us too?" Helen looked up from basting a turkey, her face flushed from the oven's heat. "Honey, on Thanksgiving, everyone eats. That's the point. Being grateful means sharing what you have." At 6 o'clock, the German women filed into the decorated mess hall where American soldiers were already seated. But instead of the usual separation, the tables had been arranged differently. Spaces were left open between the Americans, clear invitations for the German women to sit among them, not apart. It was Corporal Williams who broke the hesitation, standing and gesturing to Clara with a warm smile. "Sit here, beside me." One by one, the women took seats at mixed tables. Liesel found herself between Private Costa and Sergeant Blake. The food was passed family style, each person serving themselves and then offering the dish to their neighbor. When Blake handed Liesel the mashed potatoes, their eyes met briefly. His expression held no triumph, no superiority, just simple human warmth that said, "Eat, be filled, be well." December brought the first letters from Germany. They arrived in bundles, sorted by the Red Cross, their envelopes thin and worn from the long journey across the Atlantic. Captain Warren distributed them during evening assembly, calling names in her careful pronunciation. Some women received letters, most did not. The silence of those whose names were never called was heavier than any words could be. Liesel's letter came from her younger sister Ilse, written in pencil on paper so thin it was nearly transparent. She carried it to her bunk and read by lamplight, her hands shaking as she decoded the careful language designed to pass censors. Between the lines of forced optimism, the truth emerged, stark and terrible. Their mother was dead, killed in an air raid the previous summer. Their father had survived but was injured, unable to work. Ilse was living with an aunt in the countryside, eating once a day if they were fortunate. "Turnip soup," she wrote. "Sometimes with a potato if we can find one. I dream about the bread you used to bring from the hospital kitchen. Do you remember how we thought we were hungry then?" The letter fell from Liesel's hands. She thought of the turkey she had eaten the previous week, the mashed potatoes swimming in butter, the pie with its flaky crust. Her stomach turned with guilt so profound it felt like physical illness. While she had been fed and warmed and treated with unexpected kindness, her sister had been starving. Her mother had died. Her father suffered alone. Greta received news too, written by a neighbor because her own family could not. Her father's bakery was rubble. Her mother and younger brother had disappeared during the evacuation of Munich, their whereabouts unknown. The neighbor wrote with blunt honesty, "Do not expect to find them when you return." Most who left the city did not survive the journey. That night, the German women gathered in their barracks in spontaneous, wordless communion. Those who had received letters shared their contents in whispered German. Those who had received nothing grieved for the silence that might mean anything. Clara sobbed openly, clutching a letter that told her both parents were gone, her childhood home destroyed, nothing remaining of the life she had known. The next morning, breakfast was the same abundant meal it had always been: oatmeal, milk, bread with jam, coffee with sugar. But Liesel could not eat. She stared at her full plate and saw her sister's hollow cheeks, her father's injuries, her mother's grave in a city cemetery that might itself no longer exist. The food that had seemed like miracle now felt like accusation. Sergeant Blake noticed her untouched tray. He approached carefully, his farmer's intuition sensing something beyond ordinary sadness. "Bad news from home?" he asked gently. Liesel nodded, unable to speak. Blake was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised her. "My brother died at Normandy, got the telegram in July." He gestured to her plate. "Couldn't eat for 3 days after. Felt wrong to be full when he was gone." The guilt did not disappear, but it transformed into something else. a need to honor the hunger of those left behind by refusing to waste the abundance offered here. Liesel began eating again, but differently, with reverence for each bite that her sister could not take. And she began to talk more with the Americans who fed her, searching for understanding in a world that had stopped making sense. It was Greta who first suggested teaching the Americans to make German food. She approached Helen in the kitchen on a cold January morning, her English still halting but her intention clear. "I show you? Make bread? German bread? Like my father?" Helen looked up from chopping onions, her eyes red from the fumes. She had been cooking the same rotation of American dishes for months, and the request sparked something in her curiosity, maybe, or the universal language of bakers recognizing each other across enemy lines. "You want to teach me?" "Ja. Yes." Greta's hands moved unconsciously through the motions of kneading. "Is good bread. You have flour, yeast. I make for everyone?" That afternoon, Greta stood at the large work table with Helen beside her, teaching and learning simultaneously. Greta's hands moved through the familiar ritual of bread making, while Helen translated measurements and techniques into American equivalents. The other women gathered to watch, drawn by the smell of yeast and the sight of Greta doing what her father had done, what generations of her family had done. The bread that emerged from the oven was dense and dark, nothing like the fluffy white loaves the Americans were accustomed to. But when Sergeant Blake tasted it, still warm, with butter melting into its hearty texture, he nodded with appreciation. "This is real bread," he said. "Bread that fills you up, that means something." The exchange opened floodgates. Clara taught Corporal Williams how to make kartoffel salad, the potato salad her mother had made every Sunday. Liesel showed Private Costa the proper way to prepare rotkohl, red cabbage braised with apples and vinegar, a dish that required patience and care. The Americans reciprocated, teaching the German women about cornbread and biscuits, about the southern cooking that some guards had grown up with, about regional dishes that varied as much as Germany's own cuisine. The kitchen became neutral ground, where wars were forgotten in the shared vocabulary of recipes and techniques. Helen began keeping a notebook, where she recorded the German recipes in her careful handwriting, and Greta did the same with American dishes, creating a document that was part cookbook and part peace treaty. Private Costa brought his grandmother's recipe for pasta sauce, written in Italian, and worked with Liesel to translate it into German and English simultaneously. They laughed at the confusion, at the three languages tangling together, at the absurdity of an Italian-American and a German nurse trying to communicate through tomatoes and garlic. Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, who visited weekly with her church group, witnessed one of these cooking sessions and was moved to tears. She wrote in her journal that night, "I saw the future today. Not in treaties or politics, but in a kitchen where enemies taught each other to make bread." February 1945 brought news that shattered the fragile peace the women had built in the kitchen. American newspapers began publishing photographs from liberated concentration camps. The images were grainy but unmistakable skeletal figures behind wire, mass graves, evidence of systematic murder on a scale that defied comprehension. Captain Warren made the newspapers available in the common room, believing the women had a right to know what had been done in their country's name. Liesel found Greta standing before the bulletin board where the photographs were pinned, her face drained of all color. The headline read, "Horror at Bergen-Belsen, Thousands Dead." Below it, images showed conditions that made their worst fears about American captivity seem like paradise. These prisoners had not been fed ham and beans. They had been starved deliberately, methodically, as a matter of policy. "This cannot be real," Greta whispered in German, but her voice carried no conviction. She had seen the photographs from Dachau, from Buchenwald, from places she had never heard of but that existed mere miles from towns she knew. "We would have known, someone would have told us." But even as she spoke, Liesel remembered things she had chosen not to see. Whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Neighbors who disappeared overnight. Questions that were met with warnings not to ask. The truth was, they had known something. They had simply chosen the comfort of ignorance over the burden of knowledge. Clara was crying, surrounded by other women who looked equally devastated. "I served that country," she said, her voice breaking. I wore the uniform proudly. I believed we were the good ones, that we were defending civilization. She gestured at the newspapers with shaking hands. This is what we defended? This? The Americans watched the German women's reaction with complex emotions. Some felt vindication. See, this is what you fought for. This is why we had to defeat you. Others felt unexpected sympathy for these young women confronting the betrayal of everything they had believed. Sergeant Blake found himself thinking of his own niece, barely older than Clara, and wondering what he would want for her if she had been caught on the wrong side of history. That night, no one ate dinner. The mess hall sat prepared with its usual abundance: roasted chicken, vegetables, fresh bread, but the German women could not bring themselves to enter. The contrast between their full plates and those photographs of starvation felt obscene, unbearable. They gathered instead in the barracks, sitting in silence that was occasionally broken by sobs. Helen found Greta in the kitchen after midnight, standing alone in the dark. "You should sleep," Helen said gently. "How do we sleep after seeing that?" Greta replied. "How do we eat? How do we do anything knowing what was done?" She turned to face Helen, her eyes red. "You have fed us. You have been kind to us. But we do not deserve kindness. We deserve to starve like those people starved." Helen was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that would stay with Greta forever. "Starving you won't feed them. Being cruel to you won't undo the cruelty they suffered." April 19, 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Captain Warren called an assembly to announce that repatriation procedures would begin within 6 weeks. The German women would be processed, documented, and transported back to their homeland, back to the country that had committed atrocities in their name, back to cities reduced to rubble and families scattered or dead. Liesel sat in her bunk that night, unable to sleep. She thought of her sister Ilse, still struggling to survive in the countryside with their injured father. She thought of the duty she owed to family, to blood, to the country of her birth. But she also thought of the past 6 months, of the transformation that had occurred within these wire fences. She had learned to see Americans not as enemies, but as individuals capable of extraordinary kindness. She had discovered parts of herself that only emerged when she was treated with dignity rather than propaganda. Greta found her in the darkness. "You are awake too," she said, sitting on the edge of Liesel's bunk. "I cannot stop thinking about the choice ahead of us." "What choice?" Liesel asked. "We are prisoners. We go where they send us." "But what if we could choose?" Greta's voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking the thought aloud might make it treasonous. "What if we could ask to stay?" The idea hung between them like something forbidden. To choose America over Germany, abundance over deprivation, forgiveness over judgment, it felt like betrayal of the deepest kind. And yet, the pull of it was undeniable. Here, they had been fed. Here, they had been seen as human beings capable of growth and change. Here, they had found something that Germany could no longer offer: hope. Over the following days, quiet conversations spread through the barracks. Some women were adamant about returning. They had family waiting, or they believed their duty lay in rebuilding what had been destroyed. But others, like Liesel and Greta, found themselves imagining a different future. A future where they did not have to carry the weight of their country's sins, where they could start fresh, where the kindness they had experienced might continue. Clara was torn most visibly. She had no family left in Germany, no home to return to. But the guilt of staying felt crushing. "If I remain here," she said to Liesel, "am I abandoning my country when it needs people most, or am I just a coward choosing the easy path?" "I do not think any path is easy now," Liesel replied. On May 1st, Liesel approached Captain Warren's office with Greta and Clara beside her. Her heart hammered as she knocked on the door. When the captain looked up from her desk, Liesel spoke in the careful English she had practiced for hours. "Captain Warren, we wish to ask something difficult. Is there any way, any possibility, that some of us might stay in America instead of returning to Germany?" The question hung in the air between captor and captive, between past enemies and possible future friends. Captain Warren's response took 3 weeks to arrive from Washington. During that time, life in the camp continued in suspended animation. The women worked in the kitchen, shared meals with their captors, and waited for a decision that would determine the rest of their lives. Sergeant Blake taught Greta advanced bread-making techniques. Helen helped Liesl write letters in English to potential sponsors. Private Costa brought his mother to meet Clara, and the older Italian woman embraced the German girl as if she were family. When the answer finally came, it was neither simple approval nor flat denial. 11 women, including Liesl, Greta, and Clara, would be allowed to apply for displaced person status if they could secure American sponsors willing to vouch for their character and provide initial support. The process would be complicated, requiring paperwork and patience. But it was possible. Against all odds and precedent, it was possible. Mrs. Dorothy Patterson immediately offered to sponsor Liesl, providing housing and helping her secure work as a translator. Helen sponsored Greta, who would work in a commercial bakery in Boston. Private Costa's family sponsored Clara, bringing her into their home like a daughter. The remaining women who chose to stay found sponsors through church groups and community organizations moved by their story of transformation. The women who decided to return to Germany did so without bitterness. They understood that both choices required courage, that staying and leaving were equally valid responses to impossible circumstances. On the morning of June 10, 1945, the camp held a final shared meal. German dishes sat beside American ones, on the serving tables dark rye bread next to cornbread, rot coal beside green beans, apple strudel next to apple pie. Sergeant Blake stood to speak, his farmer's voice rough with emotion. "When you arrived, we saw enemies. You saw the same in us. But food has a way of telling truth that words cannot. Breaking bread together, we learned that people are just people, regardless of the uniforms they wear or the flags they salute." Greta rose next, her English now confident. "You taught us that kindness is not weakness, that feeding your enemies does not make you foolish, it makes you human. We came here expecting cruelty and found grace. We came here expecting to stay hungry and found abundance. Most importantly, we came here as prisoners, and you treated us as people worth saving." 20 years later, Liesl stood in her own kitchen in Massachusetts, teaching her American-born daughter to make her grandmother's potato soup. Greta's bakery had become a Boston institution, famous for breads that bridged German tradition and American innovation. Clara had become a nurse, following the path Liesl had once walked, dedicating her life to healing as redemption for the harm her country had caused. They gathered annually on Thanksgiving, these women who had chosen to stay, joined by the Americans who had chosen to see them as human. They served ham and beans alongside sauerbraten, apple pie alongside strudel. And they remembered that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply feeding your enemies until they become your friends.